Episode 2 begins. Before Montassard, the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem was in a death spiral. The treasury was empty. Fortresses needed repairs that couldn't be funded. Knights were deserting because they weren't being paid. Merchants wouldn't extend credit because they assumed the kingdom would fall soon. Recruitment was impossible. Why would anyone travel from Europe to join a losing cause? After Montassard, everything changed. The captured wealth wasn't just gold, it was credibility. European nobles, who had been reluctant to send reinforcements, suddenly saw Jerusalem as a viable enterprise worth supporting. Merchants began extending credit again. New recruits arrived from Europe, attracted by stories of the impossible victory and the promise of battlefield spoils. The kingdom's fortresses got the repairs and upgrades they desperately needed. Most importantly, the psychological impact was enormous. Before Montassard, many crusaders believed they were just delaying inevitable defeat. After Montassard, they believed they could actually win. That shift in morale affected everything: how aggressively commanders made decisions, how hard soldiers fought, how much civilians were willing to sacrifice. Saladin himself, in his correspondence after the battle, admitted that Montassard had set back his plans by years. He had expected to conquer Jerusalem and then move on to secure other territories. Instead, he spent the next several years rebuilding his forces and his reputation. One battle, fought by 500 exhausted knights led by a dying teenager, had bought the Crusader kingdom almost a decade of survival. In the brutal arithmetic of medieval politics, that was everything. The boy king who prayed over a field of corpses. As the sun set on November 25, 1177, the battlefield fell silent. 20,000 bodies lay scattered across the plain of Montassard. The surviving crusaders, exhausted beyond description, began the grim work of identifying their own dead and stripping usable equipment from enemy corpses. And in the middle of this field of carnage, King Baldwin IV did something that was recorded by multiple witnesses. He dismounted his horse, with help, because he could barely stand, and knelt among the bodies. His attendants tried to stop him, worried he would collapse and not be able to rise. But Baldwin insisted. On his knees, surrounded by the dead, this 16-year-old leper king whose body was falling apart prayed. Not a prayer of triumph. Not a boastful celebration of victory. Instead, he whispered the words from Psalm 115. "Not to us, Lord, not to us, but to your name give glory." It was a recognition that what had happened here defied human explanation. 500 against 26,000. Exhausted men defeating a fresh army. A king who should have been dead leading his forces to impossible victory. Baldwin, even in his moment of greatest triumph, attributed the victory not to his own genius, but to divine intervention. Whether you believe that explanation or prefer natural causes, Saladin's overconfidence, the element of surprise, tactical brilliance, Baldwin's humility in that moment is striking. He had just proven every doubter wrong, had achieved something that would be studied by military historians for centuries. And his response was to kneel in a continued blood-soaked mud and give thanks. It tells you everything you need to know about why his men followed him into the impossible. A victory that shook an empire. The news of Montassard spread across the medieval world like a shockwave. In Damascus, Cairo, and Baghdad, Muslim leaders, who had considered Saladin the inevitable unifier of Islamic territories, began questioning his judgment. How does a commander with overwhelming force lose to a tiny opposing army? Was this divine judgment? Was Saladin's blessing removed? The political consequences were immediate and severe. Egyptian nobles, who had grudgingly accepted Saladin's rule, began plotting against him. Syrian emirs who had allied with him started making independent deals with the Crusaders. Saladin's carefully constructed coalition, built over years of diplomacy and military success, began cracking. He had to spend the next 2 years not expanding his territory, but consolidating what he already held, crushing internal rebellions, and proving he was still worthy of leadership. The Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, who had supported Saladin's campaigns, sent a notably cool letter asking for explanations of what had happened. It was medieval politics at its most brutal. One defeat erased years of victories. But the impact went beyond politics. Monqasar became a crisis of faith for many Muslims. How could Allah have allowed such a devastating defeat? Some theologians wrote that it was punishment for the army's relaxed discipline and overconfidence. Others claimed it was a test. Still others began to question whether the Crusades might actually have divine support. The psychological impact of Monqasar on the Muslim world was profound and lasting. It took Saladin years to rebuild not just his army, but his reputation and the confidence of his allies. One afternoon of catastrophic defeat had undone almost a decade of careful empire building. A defeat Muslims called divine punishment. Muslim chroniclers struggled to make sense of what had happened at Monqasar. This wasn't like losing a close battle to a worthy opponent. This was an absolute catastrophe against an enemy that shouldn't have had any chance of victory. The historian Ibn al-Athir wrote that Allah turned his face from the believers that day, a remarkable admission of divine disfavor. Other Muslim writers described it as punishment for the army's pride and complacency. Sermons across the Islamic world pointed to Monqasar as evidence that Muslims had strayed from proper devotion and were being punished for their sins. Some blamed Saladin personally, suggesting he had allowed worldly ambition to override religious duty. Others blamed the soldiers for treating the campaign like a pleasure excursion rather than a holy struggle. The theological crisis was real and deep. If jihad, holy war fought in Allah's name, could result in such catastrophic defeat, what did that mean about divine will? Were the Crusaders actually favored by God? Had Muslims misunderstood their religious obligations? These weren't academic questions. They affected recruitment, morale, and the entire ideological foundation of resistance to the Crusades. Saladin himself had to address these concerns in public letters and speeches. He framed Monqasar as a test of faith, Allah testing the believers to see who would persist despite setbacks. He promised that faithfulness would eventually be rewarded with victory. And to his credit, he did eventually achieve that victory. But it took years of effort to overcome the spiritual and psychological damage of Monqasar. One battle had shaken the entire Islamic world's confidence in its cause and its leadership. That's how complete the Crusader victory had been. 8 more years of impossible leadership. After Monqasar, Baldwin IV lived for 8 more years. 8 years that should have been medically impossible. Leprosy in the 12th century was a progressive, terminal disease. There was no cure, no treatment that did more than slightly slow the progression. Baldwin's condition deteriorated year by year. He went blind in one eye, then the other. His face deteriorated to the point where he wore a silver mask in public. His hands became completely useless, curled into claws that couldn't hold anything. He had to be carried everywhere. By his early 20s, he couldn't walk, couldn't ride, couldn't even sit upright without support. And yet, he remained king, remained in command, and Saladin continued to fear him. There are letters from Saladin to other Muslim leaders, where he explicitly refuses to launch certain campaigns because the leper king still lives and his presence stabilizes the Christian kingdom. Think about that. The greatest Muslim commander of the age, with vastly superior forces, was being deterred by a blind, paralyzed man in his early 20s, who could barely speak above a whisper. Baldwin's final years were a masterclass in leadership through pure force of personality. He couldn't lead charges anymore, couldn't personally fight, could barely make himself heard in council meetings. But his moral authority was so absolute, his previous victories so legendary, that his mere presence held the kingdom together. Knights who might have quarreled with each other fell silent when Baldwin entered the room. Nobles who might have schemed for power remembered what happened to those who underestimated the dying king. Baldwin governed not through physical strength, but through the terrifying respect he had earned at Montgassard. He was, in a very real sense, leading through the sheer weight of his reputation and the example of his refusal to surrender to either his enemies or his disease. The king Saladin feared most. When Baldwin IV finally died on March 16, 1185, at age 24, Saladin's response was telling. According to multiple sources, when informed of Baldwin's death, Saladin said, "I feared that man more than any army the Christians could field." This wasn't just a diplomatic platitude, Saladin meant it. For 8 years after Montgassard, every time Saladin planned a campaign against Jerusalem, he had to factor in the possibility that Baldwin would somehow pull off another miracle. It created a kind of psychological paralysis. Saladin had overwhelming military superiority, but he'd learned at Montgassard that numbers alone weren't enough against Baldwin. So he waited. He postponed invasions. He made excuses to his allies about why the time wasn't quite right to attack Jerusalem. Some historians argue that Saladin was genuinely waiting for Baldwin to die before launching his final conquest. It sounds absurd. A mighty sultan deterred by a blind, paralyzed young man who had to be carried into battle on a litter. But that's the power of reputation in medieval warfare. Baldwin had achieved something that lived beyond his physical capabilities. He had become a symbol, an idea, a psychological weapon that worked even when his body had completely failed. When news of Baldwin's death reached Saladin's court, military planning immediately accelerated. Within months, Saladin was launching the campaign that would culminate at the Battle of Hattin and the reconquest of Jerusalem. He had been waiting for the leper king to die. And once Baldwin was gone, the Crusader kingdom's days were numbered. One man's life had been the difference between survival and collapse. The victory that delayed history. Here's a historical thought experiment. What if Montgassard had never happened? If Saladin had taken Jerusalem in 1177 as planned, the entire trajectory of Crusader history changes. The Third Crusade probably never happens, because there would be nothing to crusade for. Jerusalem would have been in Muslim hands for years before Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus ever mobilized. The political map of Europe might be different, because so many noble families were shaped by their involvement in the Crusades. The cultural exchange between East and West that occurred during the extra decade of Crusader presence. The transmission of scientific knowledge, architectural techniques, philosophical texts, might not have happened or would have happened differently. Baldwin's victory at Montgassard bought the Crusader states a full decade of survival. 10 years that allowed another generation of children to grow up in a Christian Jerusalem. 10 years for European traders to establish networks that would shape Mediterranean commerce for centuries. 10 years for architectural marvels, like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, to be renovated and expanded. Those 10 years mattered enormously to the people living them. But they also mattered to history. Montgassard was one of those battles that genuinely changed the course of events. Not permanently. Saladin eventually did conquer Jerusalem. But the delay itself had consequences that rippled forward through time. One afternoon of impossible victory by a dying teenager gave the Crusader kingdom a decade it otherwise wouldn't have had. In the grand scheme of history, that turned out to matter quite a lot. The kingdom that fell the moment its king was gone. Baldwin died in March 1185. By July 1187, just over 2 years later, the Crusader kingdom had effectively ceased to exist. The Battle of Hattin was one of the most complete defeats in Crusader history. Saladin annihilated the Christian army in the desert, captured the True Cross, and eliminated the kingdom's military capacity in a single afternoon. 3 months later, Jerusalem surrendered. Everything Baldwin had fought to preserve was gone. The speed of the collapse is shocking. How did a kingdom that had seemed stable in 1185 completely disintegrate by 1187? The answer is that Baldwin had been the glue holding everything together. His successor, Baldwin V, was a child who died within a year. Then the crown passed to Guy of Lusignan, a weak king who couldn't command respect and made catastrophic military decisions. The nobles who had united under Baldwin's moral authority immediately started feuding with each other under Guy's incompetent rule. The careful defensive strategy Baldwin had maintained, avoiding pitched battles, preserving forces, using fortifications wisely, was abandoned in favor of aggressive, reckless campaigns that played directly into Saladin's hands. It's as if the kingdom had been a structure held up by one central pillar, and when that pillar was removed, everything collapsed at once. Historians call this the Baldwin effect, the way a single strong leader can hold together a fragile state through sheer force of will. But the moment they're gone, all the underlying weaknesses they'd been managing suddenly become fatal. Jerusalem in 1185 looked stable. But it was only stable because Baldwin had been managing its instability through brilliant leadership. Once he was gone, the kingdom lasted about as long as a house of cards in a windstorm. The lesson every army studies today. Montgessard is taught in military academies around the world as the ultimate case study in morale defeating mathematics. The U.S. Army War College includes it in discussions of leadership under impossible circumstances. Israeli military historians study it as an example of making effective use of terrain and surprise. Even modern business schools use Montgessard as a case study in crisis leadership and managing against overwhelming odds. The tactical lessons are numerous: the importance of reconnaissance, the danger of overconfidence, the value of speed and surprise, the way terrain can multiply force effectiveness. But the deeper lesson is about human factors that can't be quantified. How do you measure the impact of a leader who inspires absolute devotion? How do you calculate the combat effectiveness of soldiers who believe they're fighting for a cause greater than survival? The mathematics of medieval warfare said Montgessard was impossible. 500 against 26,000 equals annihilation. Every military manual, every historical precedent, every rational analysis pointed to inevitable Crusader defeat. But Baldwin and his knights didn't fight according to mathematical principles. They fought with a kind of reckless courage that broke the rules. And they won. That's the lesson that resonates across centuries. Under certain circumstances, intangible factors like morale, leadership, and sheer determination can overcome massive material disadvantages. It doesn't always work. Usually it doesn't work. But sometimes, just sometimes, the impossible becomes possible. And when it does, it changes history. Courage can defy calculation. The difference between the Crusaders at Montgessard and Saladin's army wasn't skill. Muslim warriors were highly trained and experienced. It wasn't equipment. Both sides had access to similar weapons and armor. It wasn't even tactics, really. Saladin was probably the more sophisticated military thinker. The difference was belief. The Crusaders rode into that battle believing, with absolute certainty, that their cause was righteous and that God stood with them. Whether that belief was objectively true doesn't matter for understanding what happened. What matters is that they believed it completely. That belief gave them permission to attempt the impossible. When you truly believe you're fighting with divine favor, the mathematical odds stop mattering. You don't charge 26,000 enemies because it makes tactical sense. You charge because you believe you're supposed to win, that the universe itself is on your side. Saladin's army, by contrast, had spent weeks being told this campaign was a formality. They were relaxed, confident, but not inspired. When the Crusaders hit them with fanatical intensity, that comfortable confidence shattered immediately. They hadn't been mentally prepared for a real fight, let alone a desperate one. Psychology in warfare isn't just about courage, it's about expectation. The side that expects to win has an enormous advantage. At Montgessard, despite every objective indicator suggesting otherwise, the Crusaders expected to win, and the Muslims expected an easy campaign. That psychological mismatch, as much as any tactical decision, determined the outcome. 500 men who couldn't imagine defeat faced 26,000 men who couldn't imagine serious resistance. And the 500 won, when history was held together by bandaged hands. There's a haunting image that captures the entire story of Baldwin IV. A young king, his hands wrapped in silk because his skin was rotting away, signing documents and issuing orders that would determine the fate of a kingdom. He couldn't hold a pen without it being bound to his hand. He couldn't feel the paper beneath his fingers. His signature was barely legible, a shaky scrawl from hands that no longer functioned properly. But those bandaged hands held together an entire kingdom for 8 years after they should have failed. Think about the symbolism there. The most powerful man in the Crusader kingdom was physically falling apart, literally coming apart at the seams, held together by wrappings and willpower. And yet, he remained the most formidable leader in the region. His power wasn't in his hands, it was in his mind, his courage, his refusal to accept defeat. Modern leadership literature talks about leading from the front and leading by example. Baldwin did both, but in the most extreme way imaginable. He couldn't charge ahead physically. He had to be carried into battle on a litter in his final years. But he was present. He was there, at the front, where his men could see him. That presence, more than any speech or strategy, conveyed everything his soldiers needed to know. If a dying king could refuse to surrender, how could they? Those bandaged hands signing orders, giving commands, holding the kingdom together through pure determination, they became the symbol of the entire Crusader enterprise in the 1180s. Fragile, barely functional, but absolutely refusing to quit. When those hands finally stilled in death, the kingdom they'd been holding together fell apart within 2 years. History, for a brief moment, had literally been held together by bandaged hands. The battle that became a legend of the impossible. Montgessard entered the canon of legendary battles alongside Thermopylae, Agincourt, and the Alamo, those moments when outnumbered forces achieved something that seemed to violate the laws of military science. Like the 300 Spartans holding off the Persian Empire, like Henry V archers defeating French knights in the mud, Baldwin's victory became more than just a historical event. It became a story about human potential, about what becomes possible when courage meets crisis. The reason these battles resonate across centuries isn't really about military tactics. It's about what they say about human nature. We want to believe that determination can overcome impossible odds. We want to believe that a righteous cause, properly fought for, can prevail against overwhelming force. We want to believe that one person's courage can inspire others to achieve the impossible. Whether these beliefs are realistic doesn't matter for their cultural power. Montgessard gave people permission to hope in hopeless situations. It became evidence that miracles, however you define them, can actually happen. Every military underdog for the past 800 years has been compared to Baldwin at Montgessard. Every time a small force faces overwhelming odds, someone invokes this battle as proof that victory is possible. That's what makes certain battles legendary, not just that they were won, but that they expanded humanity's understanding of what's achievable. Montgasard proved that the impossible is sometimes just the improbable waiting for the right circumstances. And that lesson, far more than the tactical details of medieval cavalry charges, is why we're still talking about this battle nearly 850 years later. A moment when the impossible became reality. On November 25, 1177, for approximately 3 hours, the normal rules of warfare were suspended. Everything that should have happened didn't. The larger army should have won, but lost. The exhausted troops should have collapsed, but kept fighting. The dying king should have stayed behind, but led from the front. The impossible became real. And here's what makes that moment so powerful. Everyone involved knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't a battle where the significance only became clear years later. The soldiers fighting it, the chroniclers recording it, the commanders directing it. They all understood in real time that they were part of something historic. Muslim soldiers who survived Montgasard told their grandchildren about the day when 500 Christian knights appeared like demons and destroyed an army. Christian knights who fought there never stopped talking about it for the rest of their lives. Baldwin himself knew he had achieved something that would outlive his diseased, failing body. The Battle of Montgasard became the defining moment of his reign, the proof that his suffering had meaning, that his leadership mattered, that his refusal to surrender had changed history. A 16-year-old leper king, who should have been dead, led 500 knights, who should have been annihilated, against 26,000 warriors, who should have won easily, and created a victory that military historians still study with a mixture of admiration and bafflement. For one afternoon in the desert of Palestine, a dying boy held back the tide of history through sheer force of will. The impossible became reality. And the medieval world would never be quite the same.